Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the CCC Symposium on Computer Research Addressing National Priorities and Societal Needs. Before we get going, I just thought I would give you a few information items and highlights for the day. So we've got the day 2 agenda up on the screen. You can see that the first session this morning is going to be on controlling our data with both keynote and some panel discussions, as well as a discussion by Deirdre Mulligan about some workshops that we've run. After lunch, we are going to, in fact, change over, and up till now we've been talking, really having talks coming from the research and from the kind of mission communities that this research would be aimed towards. In the afternoon, what I'd like to do is to kind of shift gears and talk a bit more about, well, how could we better support and leverage the sort of research that we've been hearing about yesterday and that we'll be hearing about this morning. So we have a keynote by Tom Khalil from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and then a panel that consists of Jim Carosa from NSF, Keith Marzullo from OSTP, Gil Vandertop from SRC, and Chris Menzel from the Moore Foundation. So different dimensions of funding research, and hopefully we can strike up a conversation about how we can take many of the ideas that we've been talking about and potentially move them forward for the future. A couple of other quick things that I wanted to mention. Several of you I know we will be supporting your travel here, so we will be sending out a reimbursement form. Accompanied with that reimbursement form, there's going to be a short survey. One of the things we're really interested in within the CCC is understanding what sort of impact these types of events have. And so we would really appreciate any sort of feedback you can give us, either formally through a survey or even informally, really at any time, about how something that you heard here or somebody that you met here or an idea that came into your head had an impact, so that we can capture that and use that to help guide and develop new events in this area. I'll also remind you we are webcasting. Just to give you kind of rough numbers, yesterday we had about 140 people in person in the room. We had about 70 to 80 participants online viewing the live stream as well. So there is an audience out there that's listening to you. It's not just the people in this room. So if you have a question or a comment, please make sure you speak into the microphone. If you're moderating, please try to make sure that any sort of discussion gets recorded again through a microphone for the web audience. With that, I would like to get us going on our first session today. So I'm going to turn the podium over to another CCC Council member, Cynthia Dwork from Microsoft Research, to take us through that first session. Cynthia.
Good morning. Our keynote speaker this morning is Butler Lampson. Butler is a technical fellow at Microsoft. He's the winner of the Turing Award, the Draper Prize, and many other accolades for his foundational work on early computers and computer systems, from the Alto personal computer to the Ethernet, through his work on operating systems, displays, printers, programming languages, and security. He's also a member of the National Academy of Engineering. Butler will set the theme for this morning's, the first session this morning, discussing personal control of our individual data. This will be followed by a small panel of 3 with Rich Zemmel discussing fairness in classification as allowing society to help people control how their data are used. Daniel Ford on the topical subject of iPhone security, so that you can understand more about what was going on in the FBI-Apple debate. And I will talk about differential privacy, which is a definition of privacy tailored to the statistical analysis of big data, as a solution concept to some aspects of the controversial right to be forgotten. So Butler, please.
Thanks, Cynthia. Oh. Why doesn't it do anything? This button, right? Oh, this is forward. There we go. Thank you. Oh, I see. I had it upside down. That was confusing. The work I'm going to tell you about grew out of a project that I ran inside of Microsoft for a year or two, several years ago. I got together a fairly disparate group of people with different backgrounds, including Cynthia and Dana Boyd, whom many of you might know, to study the question of what might be sensible ways of regulating the use of personal data on the net, given that the way that we currently have, which is notice and consent, pretty clearly hasn't worked well. And what this turned into, from my point of view anyway, I don't think I succeeded in bringing all the other members of my group along with me on this, but it turned into the view that what one should aspire to as a technologist is to establish some technical foundations on the basis of which one could build a different regulatory regime, since it's perfectly clear that we can't have a single regulatory regime for the entire world, given that different countries and different cultures have different priorities for these things. So a little bit of sort of obvious background. It's always good to bear in mind what it is, why do we have a problem? What's different about online data? And the fundamental things are that it's widespread. There's a lot of it. It's persistent, easy to copy, and so forth. And also, in addition to that, what makes things even worse from the point of view of privacy is that it's accessible. It's relatively easy to find things by using search, and it's relatively easy to connect things by using links. This means that privacy through obscurity doesn't work anymore. Second important point, I think, is that this is not true yet today, but it certainly is going to be true in the very near future, that data about what people are doing in the physical world will be just as important as data that starts out digitally in the form of search histories or whatever. Some examples of this we already have very clearly. For instance, there are voluminous records of where automobile license plates, where and when automobile license plates have been, that are collected by hundreds of thousands of cameras that photograph these things, and it's very easy to do OCR on those license plates. And the third point is, these are not problems that can be solved by technology alone. There are very few problems that can be solved by technology alone. An interesting current example of this is the collapse of the Bitcoin governance mechanism, which was based on the proposition that nobody could control more than half of the mining capacity. Unfortunately, the way mining is done these days is with special purpose chips, and there's a small number of people in China that have bought up more than half of them. So they control it, contrary to the theory. So technology can support the rules, but it can't determine what the rules should be, and it can't enforce the rules all by itself. So it's good also to bear in mind, what are we trying to accomplish in regulating the use of data? The basic motivations, I think, are two. One is to maintain a balance of power among people, companies, and governments. And in particular, if you're not careful, people will come out on the short end of the stick. And to serve the public good, to facilitate innovation, research, law enforcement, and all kinds of other things. Many of the issues that arise from a regulatory point of view are covered by existing law, and it's always good to bear that in mind, because it's always very dangerous to make new law, because it's so hard to figure out what the consequences might be. A third principle that I think is often overlooked is the choices that you present to individual people have to be simple. And my rule of thumb for this is that it has to be one screen that tells the whole story for most people, because that's all people have the patience to look at and absorb and think about. And the fourth thing that's good to bear in mind is that it's in the nature of regulatory regimes that they change fairly slowly and that they have unintended consequences. Often people say, why should we worry about this? We've got a reasonably stable situation now. Some people are unhappy with it, but basically they're just gripers, and everything is really fine. So certainly from the point of view of a company like Microsoft, why should we worry about this? Well, aside from possible competitive issues, it seems very clear that more regulation is coming. People strongly feel that they want personal control of their data. And even when you talk to them and explain to them and get them to understand that it'll be a pain to exercise this personal control, and they probably won't actually do it, they still want it. Regulators take the view, that many of them, that control of data is a human right. So you can't say we're not going to do it because it costs too much or whatever. This is especially true in the US, but there are some signs that it might come to be true in some US states. And many firms, although in general the stance of industry is that they'd like not to have regulation, many firms would actually like to have consistent and accepted rules because they think it'll help them to build strong relationships with consumers and because they don't want to be jerked around. Who wins and who loses in this story? Basically, my view is regulation serves the individual by giving them some amount of control over how their data, where their data is and how it gets used. And it costs everybody else. And it's important to recognize that and not to have illusions about what the trade-offs are. Firms who are interested in profit want to promote innovation. They want to be free to innovate. They want things to be cheap. Government has all kinds of interests, most of which are contrary to the idea that individuals should be in control. And so that's the way it is. So here's an ideal model for personal control of my data. I keep my data in a vault. I control the vault. If you want to get access to my data, you bring me a query. I look at the query. If I like it, I admit the query into the vault, and the vault, an answer gets computed, and I give it back to you. And if I don't like your query, then I tell you to go away. So there's a million reasons why this won't work. It's too expensive. It's too slow. It leaves entirely open the question of what are legitimate as opposed to illegitimate ways of using the result that gets computed. And it also prevents any aggregation of the data for research and public good. And there's other problems, too. So that's not going to work. So here's a more practical idea. Let's try to accomplish the following things. You're empowered to control your data. That means you can find out where it is. You can ask, you can get back from the holders of the data that they have about you. Get a copy of it, that is. You can limit the way that it's used. You can do this any time, not just, you don't have to make the decision at the time the data is collected. You can do it everywhere across the whole internet. You can do it in a way that's consistent as opposed to being different for different sorts of data handlers and different sorts of devices. You can establish a simple, coarse-grained policy that you can actually understand, that has reasonable defaults, and you can remain anonymous. This seems like a good set of goals. It might not be possible to achieve all of them. And in particular, one obvious conflict is going to be that there are going to be legal regimes that say that even if I would like to control certain aspects of my data, I'm not going to be able to because the society has decided that something else is more important. A random, relatively uncontroversial example of this is you might think that the price you paid for the house that you bought is private information, but actually it's very well established in law that that's a matter of public record. So that's just a tiny example of a piece of data that you might very well think of as being personal that isn't. Well, it's still personal, but you can't exercise much control over it. So how could we possibly achieve these goals? These ideas grow out of some thoughts that Craig Mundy started promulgating about 5 or 6 years ago. He said we should give up on trying to control collection of data because it doesn't work. Instead, we should try to control use of data. So how can we actually implement that? Here's the notion. Every piece of data is going to carry a tag, and the purpose of the tag is to give a link to the current policy for use of that data. You're going to be able to establish a simple coarse-grained policy, and the handlers are going to be obligated to respect that policy. That is, whenever they want to use the data, they have to follow the tag to the policy, find out what it says, and obey it. There's not going to be any centralized database for all of this. Instead, there are going to be two kinds of players. They're the data handlers who actually hold the data and are obligated to respect the policy. And then there are agents that you choose and control, sort of in the same way that you choose an email provider. And there's going to be two kinds of agents. They're going to be what you can think of as a personal agent, which is responsible for managing your different personas, and which you can think of as being hosted on some personal device like your phone or a laptop. It's okay for it to be offline. It's obviously not okay for the agent that can tell handlers what the policy is to be offline, because handlers need to be able to find out the policy anytime. So you also need a policy service that can tell your handlers your policy. And that has to be reasonably highly available and accessible and so forth. Clearly, this scheme is not going to work for data handlers that are not subject to regulation. This is not going to help me with some rogue individual who gets hold of some data that I would prefer to keep secret. But it is going to help with any organization that's within the reach of a regulatory regime, which I believe is the most that we can hope for. So just a few scenarios to illustrate how this might work. If you move and you want to know who has your contact information so you can update some of those people and decide that you don't want some other people to have your new contact information. A school might need to contact a parent in an emergency. They can use an application that has access to your location data, and the job of the application is just to tell the school what phone number to call for the most accessible parent at the moment. You want to see fewer and more interesting ads. You decide to disable double-click, but you still are willing to see ads from Neiman Marcus and so forth. So how does it work? The data handler tags your data when it acquires it, and the tag includes a link to your policy. So as the data handler acquires your data, the tag comes along with it. You can think conceptually of the tag being issued by your agent and attached to the data. Once the data is tagged, the tag stays with the data if it gets copied. And any computation that's done on the data, the tag stays with the result of the computation as well, okay, unless there's enough aggregation that your privacy is being adequately preserved. I'm not going to talk about how much aggregation that might be. And if you get re-identified, for example, if someone takes a picture of you and then uses face recognition to figure out that it's you, at the time of the re-identification, the tag has to be reapplied. And that's especially important for physical world data. So for example, if a license plate gets recognized based on some database that the DMV keeps, there's going to be a tag there that's going to be put on the identified license plate. And the basic rule is handler has to check the policy before using the data and obey it. And as I said, this is obviously only going to work for handlers that are subject to regulation. So what is a tag? A tag is some sort of numeric ID so that you can be anonymous, together with the URL of your policy service. And that's the way the handler gets to the policy service, just by following the URL, no rocket science. The handler queries the policy service using that URL, and the service remembers the queries so that you can find out who has been using your data. And the notion is that there should be a simple policy, because otherwise people aren't going to be able to understand the policy, and also it's not going to be possible to deploy it widely unless it's extremely simple. And that means that almost all of the work that people do on policy languages and so forth is not going to be very helpful, because it's all much too complicated. And you can never get agreement. Here's a picture that shows how it goes. On the left-hand side are your agents, are the things that you control, your individual agent and your policy service. On the right-hand side is the handler. The regulator makes rules about the handler. So the first thing that happens is you set the policy. I'm very proud of these animations, by the way. I don't do too many animations, but it's actually quite cool. So you tell your policy service, your agent tells your policy service what your policy is, and then you provide some data to a handler. Along with it, you provide the tag, which is this numeric ID plus the URL. The handler is now storing the data, and along with the data, it's storing the tag. Now the handler wants to use the data. At this point, the handler has to get the policy. And the handler has an obligation to get reasonably up-to-date policy. That doesn't mean up-to-date to the second, but it means maybe up-to-date to the day or the week or the month, something reasonably sensible. So the handler goes to the policy service and says, I'm handler H, and here's the numeric ID, and here's the type of data that I'm holding. What's the policy? And it gets back, yes, it's okay to use that type of data, or no, it isn't. Finally, if I want to know what data of mine is being held, I've been calling that claiming. There'll be a later slide that shows how I know which handlers to talk to, but once I've figured that out, I go to the handler and I say, here's my ID, signing the request to give me back the data, and the handler gives back the data. So that's the basic, sort of the simplest case. Here's a slightly more complicated case where one handler passes data on to another one. This doesn't really cause any problems for this mechanism. And the reason is that, that everything is data-centric and not device-centric or service-centric. So you set the policy in the same way. You hand over the data to handler 1 in the same way. Now handler 1 transfers data to handler 2, and along with the data comes the tag, the NID plus thingy. And then handler 2, exactly as we saw in the previous slide, if handler 2 wants to use the data, it has to ask the policy service what the policy is, and it gets back a yes or a no. And the claiming is the same as before. I think we'll skip over this anonymity slide. And the final question is, what about finding your data and claiming it, finding out what it is? This is a little bit tricky because you talk to lots of handlers, and handlers transfer data off to other handlers and so forth. So it's not, you might think at first sight that the way to deal with this is to say, well, okay, if I give my data to PayPal, I should remember that, and then I can go and ask PayPal for it. But PayPal may very well pass it on to someone else without telling me. So that isn't going to work. What is going to work, though, is if PayPal passes it on to someone else who's playing by the rules, and that person ever uses the data, they have to consult the policy service. And what that means is the policy service knows that they've got the data. And so I can ask my policy service who's got my data. So here's the picture. The policy service is now going to additionally keep track. He's going to have a list of all the handlers that have queried it. And now my agent can ask the policy service what handlers have gotten my data, get back that information, and then, as we saw before, it can go to each individual handler and claim the data and get it back. There are some problems with this whole thing, and one of them is intrinsic. If you're going to have control of your data, then in some sense, you're giving up some privacy. And the reason is that you can be coerced. If you have control, then you can be coerced into exercising that control. Being able to track handlers is a useful capability, as I hope I made clear in the previous slides, but it's vulnerable. It's just like browsing history, which exposes a lot of information about you. If you have your access to your browsing history, then you can be coerced into giving that access to other people. And this is a pretty fundamental problem. So what sort of coercions might there be? Well, one obvious one is law enforcement in the form of warrants or whatever. And the other one is personal. Parents, spouses, employers, and so forth might be in a position to coerce you. And this is, of course, not a problem that's specific to control of personal data, but it is one that's raised by the kind of mechanisms that I've been talking about. And I think it's pretty fundamental. The only sort of generic solution I know of to this problem is to have plausible deniability, mask the true data with fake data that you can return in response to coercion. But this is doubtless a subject that could be a lot of interesting discussion about. I haven't given a lot of thought to it. What form does the policy take? Well, first of all, it's very important that the policy is data-centric. It's not device-centric or service-centric, as current policies tend to be. And that seems absolutely essential because the devices and the services are constantly changing, and information is constantly moving from one to another. The tag stays with the data, and it always points to the data's policy. And the interface to policy is extremely simple. The handler says, I've got data from this identity of this type. Is it OK for me to use it or not? Certainly, optionally, the handler might be able to pass more detailed information about what it's planning to do with the data and maybe get a more detailed response. But my view is that you can't legislate that across the board because it's going to be too complicated. You're never going to be able to get agreement on how it should work. There has to be the basic policy, the standard policy has to have some very simple form. So there have to be 7 ± 2 types of data, contact, location, transaction, a few others. And we could have a big fight about what these 7 types ought to be, but it has to be limited to 7. Once you've got 50, again, you've totally lost control. Nobody will be able to understand what's going on. So certainly it would be OK to extend a type like transaction with some tree of subtypes. But that has to work in the same way that HTML works. If you see some subtype information that you don't understand, you're free to just ignore it. Because otherwise you're never going to be able to get agreement across the board. What sort of policy language are we going to have? Well, the basic idea of the policy is handler H may or may not use my data of type T. And it's straightforward to compose policies like this with and, or, and else. If you want to have a really complicated policy, it seems clear to me that the way to do that is to encode it in an app. Treat the app as a handler, give the app more authority, and then rely on the app to only disgorge the limited information that's appropriate to the complex policy. So one example of that was the story I told you a few minutes ago about the school needing to know the emergency contact phone number. The app that figures out what's the right phone number to use might have access to all kinds of very sensitive information that you definitely wouldn't want to have widespread. User experience for all of this. This is the thing that we understand the least about. We actually did a rather primitive prototype of most of this stuff, but we did not do any prototyping of the user experience to speak of. I mean, we had a UI, but it was not. It was only meant for techies. But I do have some principles that I think are appropriate. The first one is one I mentioned before. One screen filled with big type has to show most people's policy, because that's all most people are going to have the patience for. It's fine if this screen gives you the ability to drill down into more detail for people that care to do so. But we have to recognize that that's going to be a tiny fraction of the audience. How could this possibly work? Well, given that there's lots of decisions to be made, well, the answer has to be, for the most part, policy is going to take the form. My policy is Consumer Reports policy number 3 with the following 4 exceptions. And I get to choose whether it's Consumer Reports or the Federal Trade Commission or whatever. And again, you need to have a reasonable default to protect carefree users. And that's really all I know about the user experience part of this thing. A few details that are perhaps worth touching on. You need some way to change your policy service. And the old one needs to be able to forward queries to the new one. And optionally, you could have some kind of key escrow scheme for backing up in case you lose the information that allows you to authenticate based on your identities. Security of policy queries, just use TLS to authenticate the various connections. It's never a good idea to invent a new secure communication mechanism. I mean, we've had TLS for 20 years and it still has bugs. As I said before, the way to control complex use of data is not by elaborating the policy language. It's by having apps that can use code to implement the complex policy. And another open question for the user experience is, almost certainly people are going to want to have multiple personas. At the very least, you're probably going to want to have a personal persona and a work persona. And you may very well want to have other personas for browsing porn or doing politics or whatever it is. And there's a real question about what the user experience for that should be. Because clearly, if you get the personas mixed up, it could cause serious problems. A few refinements. The philosophy of this scheme is, typically when I talk to people about this kind of thing, they say, well, what about inference? What inference means, I think, when they ask this question is, some piece of tag data is input to some computation. What should we do about the output? And my answer to that question is there's two possibilities. One is the output carries all the tags of all the inputs to the computation. That's the straightforward information flow control answer that we learned from the NSA 40 years ago. Very conservative. Clearly isn't going to work in general. If, for example, to take a really extreme and relatively uncontroversial example, if I get data from 10,000 speakers and use it to train a speech recognition engine, I'm not going to have the tags for those 10,000 users on the trained engine. So there has to be some way to certify that applications do enough aggregation that it's okay to weaken the tags. And it's entirely up for grabs for me what that certification process ought to be. Joint rights are a big issue. If somebody takes a photograph, the photographer has some right in it, and the subjects of the photograph have some right in it, and what should you do? And to first approximation, the answer to this has to be the parties have to agree on something or other. So maybe they both have to agree in order to allow access. Both the photographer and the subject have to agree, or maybe they both have to agree in order to forbid access. We talked about different personas for personal and enterprise, and presumably if you're going to have that, probably needs to be set up in such a way that the enterprise can exercise some control over your enterprise persona. You may very well want to use multiple policy services for a variety of reasons, just as you want to have lots of identities for reasons of anonymity or because you want to have personas. I think the way to think about that is that your agent is responsible for managing these complexities so that you don't have to think about that. Certainly, it should be possible to add more frills to the policies or the data type declaration mechanism. And I think the only important constraint on that is it has to be done in the same way that HTML tags work, so that if you don't understand the extension, you're free to ignore it. In many cases, it's also very attractive to be able to track the provenance of data, how it moved around from one handler to another and so forth. And there's a relatively straightforward way to do that, which is to have an immutable log that tracks every such action and then add a pointer to the log, to the tag. So to sum all this up, I think this is a problem that's worth thinking about from just about everyone's point of view, because it seems very clear to me that more regulation is coming. And the mills of God grind rather slowly, and it'll take 5 or 10 or 15 years for these things to come to pass. But right now, it seems to me that an awful lot of the thinking about what sort of regulation is going to be is being done in a vacuum of practicality. And so we get what seem to me to be brain-dead things like the right to be forgotten. My story is you want to have practical personal control. You should be empowered to control your data, find it, limit its use, claim it, everywhere, anytime, consistently, and anonymously if you wish. And the way to achieve that is to have tags attached to the data that links the data to policy, and personas to manage your anonymous identities. And with that, I'd be happy to take questions. And then there is quite a bit of time, actually. So I'm sure I said a lot of things that people passionately disagree with. Yes, excellent.
So in my opinion, currently the main problem is that you sign some term of agreement when you get some service. You agree to some terms, and these terms basically give the
Yes.
user of that a priori.
Yes, and it's well established that governments can decide what contract terms are enforceable and what contract terms are not enforceable. And that's certainly going to be part of the regulatory side of this story.
So what will your policy do for some app that gives me a long contract, which
the law will say that you can't write that kind of contract.
Oh,
I mean, you can write it, but the courts won't enforce it.
Okay.
Just as, you can't write a contract to sell yourself into slavery either, to take a somewhat extreme example, and there's many, many examples of that.
So what would this mean if this law doesn't come? It's not here, right?
No, it's not.
Right. So what if it doesn't come about?
Well, I'm sorry. This whole scheme is only half of the story. The other half is the legal half. And one component of the legal half certainly is going to be that people can't write that kind of contract. But this whole machinery that I described is completely pointless without its legal half. But not being a lawyer, I'm not very well qualified to pronounce on what form the legal half might take. And I'm quite sure that it's going to be different in different parts of the world. Whereas my hope is that this is a sufficiently regulation neutral piece of technology underpinning that it could follow the paradigm of the rest of the internet and be uniform across the world. Because this machinery that I just described doesn't say anything about what the rules are.
So I want to ask a question about bad actors. So you talked about this wouldn't apply if something is not regulated. We've already seen in journalism that when rumor and innuendo comes out, real journalists don't cite it. But if one bad actor cites it, then everybody else says, well, it has been reported that, and then the bad information becomes public and then everybody can talk about it. If you had one bad actor that would strip off the tag, then the data becomes public, and then other sites could aggregate it or do what they wanted with it and have plausible deniability that it was public, it wasn't tagged. So obviously there's a legal issue with there being no bad actors, but we know there will be. So is there an encryption side behind this?
I do not believe this problem can be addressed by technology.
Okay.
I believe this problem can only be addressed by law. And there's a clear conflict between the desire to control the influence that a bad actor can exercise on one side and the desire to have free expression on the other side. And I have personal opinions about that, but they don't have anything to do with what I talked about today.
Okay.
And I'm absolutely convinced that this problem cannot be addressed by technology.
Hi, I'm Bart from Clemson University. I really liked the framework, and I wholeheartedly agree with your idea that transparency and control don't work, and people say they want control over the data, but they don't take it. And I think what you've shown here is kind of, I would say, the Model T of privacy. And so that means that there's a couple of steps more to take. And I think one of the problems with the policy is that a policy inherently strips away a lot of the context that people use in making these decisions. And so a lot of the research on privacy policies and like people setting their privacy settings that I've seen is that people set their privacy settings, but then when it comes to the point where they disclose their data, there's a conflict between what they actually want to do and what their policy says. It's like, yeah, sure, my policy is less open than I want it to be, or my policy is more open than I want it to be. And especially when the policy is very coarse, you often see that people end up over-disclosing. There's a misconception saying that people will under-disclose. It actually ends up being that they over-disclose. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering about your idea of, and I think you started alluding to that a little bit, is the idea of having apps help you with setting that policy. And I've done research myself on maybe using machine learning and recommender systems to figure out what your policy would be. Can you talk a little bit more about how would people kind of create their policy, update their policy, manage their policy, and maybe get some help in managing the policy over time and kind of making it more granular over time, so to say?
Well, I'm not optimistic about that.
Okay.
Making it more granular. Everyone always wants to make everything having to do with security and privacy more granular. And my instinct is always to make it less granular, because it's much more likely that it will actually work if it's less granular. All the experience we've had with granular policies so far, I believe, has been overwhelmingly negative. However, I do want to say one thing. An important property of this scheme that I didn't emphasize is that you do not have to make this decision all at once at the time that you release the data. You can change your mind about what the policy should be. And I think that's the first line of defense against the problems that you described. Whether machine learning could help me in setting a sensible policy, that's entirely up for grabs. I have no idea. We could do if anything even resembling this ever came to pass, we could do a lot of interesting experiments.
We'll keep in touch then.
Hi, John May, USC ISI. So I found it problematic that that you want it to be data-centric, because it seems to me that data has inherent value on its own, and thus it can be laundered once it exists. So to take an example that I just kind of came up with while thinking about this is, let's say you contract with Amazon that I'm going to share my address and my buying history with you, but I would prefer that you not share it with third parties at all, right? That's an instance of your scheme, right? Now, that's fine, but Amazon, completely within the law, now can say, okay, that's fine, but what I'm going to do is every time I'm on a street where I'm delivering a package, I'm going to, record a geolocation of that my truck was here at this location. And internally, they decide that, well, only the people who bought a certain kind of paint, I'm going to subset these data points and now sell those. And this is basically scrubbed data, right? They've reacquired the same data that they knew to acquire that they wouldn't have already, because they had the information that you shared with them, they're able to kind of mimic it. And that's sort of inherent in the fact that the data itself has value, whereas the unsustainable model of having a personal repository of data where I do a one-time key exchange would get around that, but of course has its own problems.
Huh? I don't see how that would help at all.
Well, if you say that the data
Amazon definitely knows that they sold me the book, and they definitely know where their truck was. I don't see any way to get around it.
Right. You could. Well, I could imagine a.
Maybe I didn't understand your example, but that was what I abstracted it to.
Sorry. What you mean? You don't see how the other model would
Right.
avoid this?
Right.
If you had an instant delete provision where you get a one-time, I'm delivering this thing right now, but I'm not going to associate that with other transactions that you've done, then you wouldn't have the actual buying history.
No, it's an interesting question. What should be done about this kind of linkage? I think you should talk to Cynthia. I can't help too much with that.
Hi, Matt Beats, UC Irvine. I find this really interesting. I'm curious. I'm not sure I'm convinced, but I'm curious. But one thing, if I understand correctly, that the mechanism is that you have a handler and a data type and a decision, right? And I'm curious if you can say more about the data type and what you imagine that to be. And it probably won't, I'm just kind of trying to think about what do we mean by data type in that case, because it's probably not what we mean when we set up types in a relational database.
The answer is the IETF has to find 7 of them that cover all the ground. And what those 7 should be, I don't have an opinion.
And you think that's possible?
Yes.
Okay,
if it's not possible, then the whole scheme crumbles into dust.
Well, and this is one of the things because
but it's going to be enormously controversial.
I study the way that people think about privacy, and privacy is thought of in uses, not in origins of data. And so saying that this is a type of data, this is step data, but it's also data about whether or not there was an earthquake or how much sex somebody has. And
yeah. Life is hard.
Defining I'm curious, that's the part I'm most skeptical about, is that how do we define those data types and so on?
Yeah, but what are you going to do? I mean, you can make infinite refinements, but then you can never get any agreement, never mind any workable implementation. You've got to make some sacrifices if you want to have control. The alternative is to live wild and free the way we do today. So yes, I agree that there's going to be all kinds of cases that are not going to be properly covered by this very crude story about data types. Maybe there should be 7 types of use as well as 7 types of data. That would be okay. But not 100. And not all this complicated stuff about earthquakes. Sorry. Cynthia might be able to help with the earthquakes if we can do enough aggregation.
Hi, Miguel Encanasawa, ACT. The policies that a user establishes, going back to the comment on context, assumes they understand the implications of what it means when they establish this policy. Now, aside from...
Seems very unlikely that they're going to understand the implications.
Well, but if they don't, the same policy has different implications in different contexts. And even we have different regional laws, national laws, global laws. So how would the user know what policy to establish, knowing that there could be different contexts and therefore different implications?
Yeah, well, most users are going to rely on consumer reports. And they're going to think about it as hard as they know how to, and there's going to be lots of problems. It's the best that I know how to do. The best is the enemy of the good. There's no solution that I can imagine
couldn't
to
there
the
be
problem that you
a
described.
data sharing policy on the end user side as well as a data use policy on each of the handler sides or so, and you have to find a match between the two, and if there is no match, there has to be a validation or verification of, do you really want to still apply this policy, because here are the new things that are going to happen.
I can't imagine how you could actually make that work, because there's so many cases. But I would be very interested to hear a concrete proposal.
Okay.
But an abstract proposal like that is always going to elicit the response that I just gave you, which is that if you actually try to do it, there's going to be too many cases and you're never going to be able to figure it out. We've been playing this game with access control for security for 40, and with information flow control for 40 or 50 years. And we've learned that if you try to cover all the cases, you just lose your mind. And the result is that you have a policy that A, nobody can understand, and B, definitely doesn't correspond to your intent.
This is the last question.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering if you can comment on the plausible impacts of such a scheme on kind of the wild and free marketplace structures that are, supported by untrammeled access to personal data today. So what does this do to, the Googles of the world, for example?
I think it'll be okay for Google. I mean, number one, Google's business wasn't so terrible in the days when they actually didn't collect most of this data. And number two, people are creative, and they'll find ways to work within these limitations. And number three, I think, it's the right way to say this. People feel pretty strongly that they want to have this control. I don't think people feel that strongly that they want to exercise it. So for the most part, my guess is that everyone will be able to continue to live fairly wild and free unless they behave outrageously. But I don't know. It's a very good question. And I can't think of any way to find out except to try it.
To try.
Okay?